So the long game of brand. It's a game that really demands a lot of focus. And I think as Dory just mentioned, and as Colin has talked a little bit about today, focus can be in short supply these days. It seems like there's always some sort of new disruptive development that's pulling our focus away from the business of brand building. You know, if we look at it this year, the story of the year really is generative AI, right? And without treading on Colin's talk too much, it may in fact be a real Gutenberg moment for us. It may in fact change everything. I've played around with it. It's very powerful, both Midjourney and ChatGPT. A couple of you may have otherwise played with DALL-E or some other programs. But there's always something like this. There's always a disruptive development that tends to command our attention. And if we turn the clock back 1 year, you know, as I see the discussion about ChatGPT and generative AI taking shape, I'm reminded of the last disruptive development that took all this attention, which is the metaverse, right? And it also intersects at this sort of nexus of technological advancement, capital, and media hype, and also, of course, you know, marketing. We're always encouraged, of course, to keep our eye out for the next new thing. I was reading something about, you know, Bill Gates in one of his letters, and at the end of 2021 said that by this time next year, we'll be taking most of our meetings in the metaverse, and that may be true. It may wind up to be a really great long-term thing. But if we look at the most recent development in the cycle of how these things tend to go, there's a lot of companies right now that are taking some of their bets away from the metaverse, even as other companies are making a strong entry point, with Apple, of course. I'm going to pause here and note that by the laws of branding conversations, I have to mention Apple. I don't make the rules, it's an example, but now that I've done it, we can all move on. What about 2021? Remember these fellas? It was really, really hard to go anywhere in 2021 without the conversation being about NFTs and how is your brand going to use NFTs. It wasn't really even a matter of whether or not you would. You know, the Harvard Business Review just sort of assumed that you should use them. So it just became a question about how. And of course, we all know that hype cycle tended to end for some folks not as well as we would have hoped, right? Now, the jury's still out. This is, of course, just a recent development. We don't know how this is going to play out over the long term. But it feels like every single year, there's something that intersects business and technology and marketing where we are all encouraged to go ahead and jump on the next big thing. And it tends to pull our focus away from the process of building brands. I call this the new big shiny thing, right? There's always something that's new and shiny, and it pulls our focus away. And the challenge with that is that brand building really demands a lot of attention and a lot of sustained long-term investment. And I'm also going to note now that, of course, by the laws of branding presentations, I have to define what a brand is. As I mentioned, they're fueled by technological advances, influx of capital, and media hype. I think of brand as a memory, or more specifically, it's a network of memories, and it really just lives in one place. It lives in the head of the consumer. If we think about it as a series of associations, I might mention a brand like Disney. And so if I think about Disney, you know, I think about my recent interactions with the brand, right? So my family and I just went on spring break. It was a great family vacation. I think about my interactions with the brand. I think about some of the experiences with their products and services, like Disney Plus. Sometimes this brand network of associations includes distinctive brand assets, right? It might be a particular set of characters or a specific long-time fluent device, like a spokesperson. Other times in the network of associations, it's all kind of mixed together with some feelings I might have about the brand, right? Maybe I think it's good value for money. Maybe I think it's sort of family-friendly. And so these interactions between these different nodes in the network, these are strengthened by every experience that we have with a brand, whether it's directly experiencing a product or service, whether it's marketing communications. And when those things are built and refreshed and restored consistently, it can be said that the brand is strong. And so why is having a strong brand an important thing? Well, strong brands tend to outperform the market. This here is a portfolio of brands that, analyzed by McKinsey, benchmarked against the MSCI, the Morgan Stanley Capital Investment. When you take a look at what happens in uncertain times, strong brands tend to be more resilient. They tend to bounce back faster. This is some data from Kantar on the left here, showing what happened during COVID, and on the right, showing what happened during the recovery from February of 2020 to April of 2021, that strong brands portfolio tended to bounce back a lot faster. And so one of the things that, of course, helps these brands bounce back faster is marketing communications, which, broadly speaking, can break down into two kinds of activities. So on the one hand, you have brand building marketing communications. And these tend to share a couple of similar features. They tend to be really highly visual. They tend to be more emotional. They tend to communicate a vibe, right? So if we kind of break this down and look at it, what is this really telling us? This idea, it's showing us the car in an exciting way, right? It's giving us a distinctive made-up word as a headline, something creative, masterpiece. And it's really trying to communicate this idea that this is a fun car to drive. And we know from BMW there's some cultural resonance with that brand, right? Like we all kind of know that really successful people tend to drive BMWs. It's just kind of what the brand means in our culture. So who is this advertisement targeted toward? I would argue that it's really targeted toward absolutely everyone. It's targeted toward the 50-year-old executive that they want to buy the car right now because she knows that buying it means that she's achieved the pinnacle of professional success. It's even targeted toward non-buyers like myself. I drive a Toyota. But if I'd never seen a BMW ad, if we'd only shown this ad to the right person at the right time and the right channel when they're just ready to buy, if I'd never heard of BMW, I wouldn't know how awesome it is and why I should covet and want one, right? It's also targeted toward the teenage non-driver who might see this ad today, and it might plant a seed that pays off 10, 20, 30 years down the road to build that cultural meaning of what the brand is. So in that sense, the real work it's doing for us is that it's trying to generate future demand. And then there's a second kind of marketing activity, one which we're all a little bit more familiar with maybe, just because it's so prevalent today, and that is performance marketing, or sometimes called brand activation, right? And the real function of brand activation marketing activity is to take that demand that exists in the marketplace right now and convert that to sales right now. And so if you sort of juxtapose, these two approaches, emotional, loosely targeted, it's not treating the ad like an argument, it's communicating a vibe. Whereas this one is more about facts, right? This is a little bit more of an argument. It's rational, it's persuasive. No waiting period. Maybe that appeals to the person who wants it right now, right? Hey, only $279 a month. That appeals to the person who has a certain budget in mind. And it's meant to convert the demand that exists in the marketplace today. And if you look at where both these activities spring from, they really both spring from the same basics of brand strategy, which is you're going to look at your target market, right? You're going to look at your segmentation and understand how to develop that broad-based emotional message, but also understand that there may be targets within that market that are in market today. And you can go ahead and develop a specific rational, persuasive messaging for them. You need to understand what what that positioning means. What's the intended image in the mind of your customer, right? And then you also need to understand what measurable changes are we working toward, because those two kinds of activities work on different timescales, but they also have different kinds of KPIs, right? Like if you look at performance marketing, it's really easy to go ahead and say, all right, I showed you that ad, you clicked on that ad, that shows up in a Google Analytics report, and then that later shows up in a sales report. I understand exactly how that works. This one's a little fuzzier, isn't it? Like it's really kind of hard to figure out exactly what the ROI is on this. And it's one of the reasons that we've seen a decline in marketing spend towards brand building ads, because it's really hard to say, I'm going to show this ad to a 14-year-old and in 30 years he's going to buy this car, right? That's just not an argument that's going to fly with your CFO, right? I mean, we're always welcome to make it, but it's probably not going to land. So for measuring brand building activity, maybe you have to do something like an annual brand tracking health survey. But it operates on a longer time scale. And as we've talked about today, it's really hard to go ahead and set that course and hold it for the long term when there's always a shiny new thing to pull us away from it. And the thing is that we've known about how all this works for just about a century. If you go back to the basics of brand management, I think it's fair to go ahead and plant a flag about 90 years ago. Neil McElroy, the president of Procter & Gamble, lays out in 1931 the basics of brand strategy in a 3-page memo, which you can summarize basically as you need to go ahead and take a look at your market, your consumer, your past history, understand what's working well and what's not. In other words, do a diagnosis, right? And then you step forward and you develop a comprehensive plan to address the weaknesses that you have, but also build upon your strengths. And once you've got that solidified, Only then do you really move into tactics and execution, figuring out how to do all that, say, omni-channel marketing that Khalif talked about today. So if all this is so simple and obvious, right? If this is as easy as I'm talking about, and we've known all of this stuff for a century, then why is it so hard to do? Well, as Dory mentioned, as other people have mentioned today, some of it is just the short-term pressures of the current business environment, right? We all have to make our number for the street. Every quarter, we have to go ahead and show that kind of growth. But I do think that, even from my personal experience, as I've gotten to know more business leaders over the course of my career, Wall Street is actually pretty good at keeping an eye on the long-term outlook. And the truth of this is really evident when you look at how businesses are valued, right? If you look at a stock price, it's not just what the business is doing today, it's discounted cash flows projected out 5, 10 years in the future. So Wall Street knows how to go ahead and keep a long-term outlook. So what's driving this trend towards short-termism? Some people think that the answer really lies with CMOs, right? This idea that the CMO tenure keeps getting shorter and shorter, and there's more pressure to land quickly and make an impact, and then become one of the 77% of CMOs who, according to Spencer Stuart, go on to a higher executive role or found another company. But I think that if you actually take this story and you zoom out a little further, the long-term trend for CMOs is actually slightly upward. If you go back and look at Spencer Stuart's annual CMO survey from 2004 through now, what you actually see is that that trend is more or less stable over the last decade or so, and has trended upwards over the last 20 years. So what's really happening? I think there's another hypothesis here, which is the rise of digital marketing, which is that all marketing moved online, where it could be easily be measured, where we could go ahead and count the clicks. And a lot of that really begins just before 2006 with the advent of Google Analytics. What this did was it inaugurated a shift away from those long-term brand building activities and more towards performance marketing because it's so much easier to measure. And that gives rise to, of course, the ad duopoly. As digital marketing moves online, there's two companies who reap the lion's share of the rewards for that, Meta and Google, represented by that big blue chunk here, showing the growth over the last 15 years. Just as a series of disclosures, One North, of course, has Meta as a client. I've worked on Google in the past, a previous agency with Ryan Schulz. But along with the rise of Google in the Meta duopoly, you have the dominance of Google Analytics as a measurement platform, right? And so during all this, there's another thing that's happening, which is the rise of marketing automation platforms. So what you see is this sort of dream taking shape. And this dream is that we can put a message in front of somebody, we can measure exactly how they click it, that's going to go ahead and convert into brand sales, and even better, we can just go ahead and automate the entire process. We can set and forget this thing. It was, in many ways, the ultimate shiny. From Moana on Disney+, a favorite in the Leahy household. Probably playing right now as I'm here. There's just a couple of problems with this, okay? So one of the big challenges is, as Dory was talking about just a few minutes ago, false signals. When you look at what Google Analytics attribution model claims versus what the econometrics show, this is a chart from Grace Kite, a great researcher and economist who Ben Magnuson is going to tell us a little bit more about today in his talk. She runs a shop called Magic Numbers. And Google Analytics is a little bit like a guy standing outside your store and tapping every customer on the shoulder and saying, "Hey, you should go in here," and claiming credit in your sales numbers. That's what that blue line here is. The delta between what Google Analytics claims in its attribution modeling and what econometric analysis shows is sometimes a 200% swing there between what's really going on and what they claim is going on. So without overstating the case, some of the numbers are a little funny. Second thing that's going on, some of the numbers are a little funny. Ad fraud and click fraud. People being shown an ad, or at least an agency says they're showing your market an ad, and people aren't really seeing it. Otherwise, bots are clicking on ads, and it's not really real people taking you to your site. This number isn't fake. That's costing brands $100 billion a year. And what's the effect of this? Am I kind of overstating this? This is an analysis of the Institute of Practitioners of Advertising Data Bank. They study thousands and thousands of campaigns over the last 20 years. And what they show, right around the peak where Google Analytics gains market dominance between 2006 and 2008, is that blue line of short-term campaigns escalates, just as marketing effectiveness starts declining. And so the result of this is that a lot of brands find themselves stuck. They experience a terrific uplift at first from digital advertising, and they shift all their money toward it, but then they get stuck on this performance plateau. That's what that middle line there is. And you see that one of the ways off of it is to restore your brand building activity, right? And one of the reasons that people get stuck on this plateau is because they're focused on a very small subset of customers. They are focusing on the customers that are in market today. And the challenge with that is that the customers who are in market today only represent about 5% of your total addressable market. That 95-5 rule, as it's come to be known, was proposed a couple of years ago by the B2B LinkedIn Marketing Institute. And the challenge is everything is a wrestling match for the 5% of the market today, and it ignores the 95% of people who could be buying tomorrow, right? It's that teenager that you show the BMW ad. That's where the real money is going to come from. This actually should be a chart that's reassuring to the CFO because it shows where the discounted cash flow is projected into the future. It shows where the value of the company is going to come from in the future. So if we think about that 5% is what performance marketing is doing, that 95% is what brand building is doing. But that 95% is really hard to measure, and that's why most people tend not to do it as much. All right, so the big question is, what happens in times of uncertainty like we're in right now, these unprecedented times? One of the first things that usually happens is, what gets cut? The marketing budget, right? At least we pull back a little bit, hedge our bets. What's the effect of that? Boston Consulting Group came out with a great meta-analysis showing that it's almost always a bad idea to cut your marketing budget in uncertain times. It tends to disrupt your shareholder return, it lowers your sales growth, it can destroy market share, and ultimately it harms the brand. I'm going to note that this isn't new information. We've actually known for about 100 years that cutting your marketing budget in a downturn is really bad for you. The first study that I could find of this was Roland Vail. He's a Harvard economist who took a look at about 100 years ago, I think this was published in 1927, what happens when you cut your marketing budget during a recession of future sales. You can see there that blue line tracks those who cut. The green line are the folks who counterintuitively increase their marketing spend during the recession. Sustained, durable market share growth in future sales. This was repeated about 20 years ago by Stephen King, not that Stephen King, there's an advertising guy named Stephen King, and Alex Beal, and also just confirmed the same data. So the challenge is, it's great to show that to your CFO, but how do you actually balance those priorities, right? How do we find our way back to the long view? How do we restore the creativity, the distinctiveness, the uniqueness that really is the hallmark of brand building? Well, for that, I can think of no better personal example of distinctive style than my boss, Kyle Peekna. Kyle's not wearing his trademark bow tie today. Of course, he is wearing a wonderfully well-stated jacket. But I think that if we just zoom in for a closer look on how all this works, we're going to find a nice path forward that's sometimes called the strategy bow tie. This is an amalgamation of a couple of different approaches. BBDO, great advertising agency, popularized the BBDO bow tie, but this also breaks down very neatly to Neil McElroy's memo from 100 years ago, three-step process. Make a diagnosis of what's going on, study the market, go ahead and create a plan or a policy, and go ahead and execute. Those of you who may be familiar with Richard Rummelt, a great business strategist, wrote a great book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, calls this a strategy kernel, diagnosis, policy, execution. But whatever you call it, it really aligns perfectly with the basics of brand strategy. And so my advice here is we may need to go ahead and ignore the shiny for just a little bit and reground ourselves in some of the basics, that targeting, that positioning, and those objectives. So as a practical matter, though, how do we go ahead and do this? About 10 years ago, two researchers followed up on a paper they'd published in 2007. Les Binet and Peter Field published a paper in 2007 called Marketing in the Era of Accountability. They revised that paper and published it. It landed like a meteor 10 years ago. It's called The Long and the Short of It. It is a terrific resource that shows how to operationalize and balance brand building while also doing activation and performance marketing. The idea roughly is you take your priorities and your budget and you split it in half. Devote half your budget to that long-term, loosely targeted, emotional message that's supposed to reach everyone. Your buyers today, your non-buyers like me, the teenager who's going to go ahead and buy your product in the decades to come. And take your other half of the budget and go ahead and develop rational, persuasive, tightly targeted messages and campaigns that will harvest existing demand. And use that short term to fuel the long term. Convert that ROI and invest it in long-term brand building and get that virtuous cycle going. If you only have to choose one over the other, though, there's a good case to be made that you should devote more resources to brand building. This is from System 1. They're a marketing automation firm that does a lot of ad testing and has one of the most robust ad testing data sets. What you're seeing here along the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is several thousand commercials that were rated according to a star system, and then figuring out what is the uplift above sales baseline to go ahead and attribute, and find a correlation between brand building activity and uplift in sales. What you can see here is that black line with the little arrow, that's sort of the baseline. Ads that hover around, the 2 to 3 rating, which are most ads are about a 2.2, 2.3. They do a pretty good job. Really highly rated 5-star ads, the more creative, the more distinctive, the more creative risks you take, which Jessica DeYoung is going to talk about in a little while about exactly how to do that. That sales uplift is huge. But it's only 3% of ads. So how do you do that on a practical matter? Choose one message and put it everywhere. Rather than trying to stuff 15 messages into an ad or into marketing communications or your content strategy or your PR strategy, choose one thing, set a course, maintain it for a while. Campaigns that run with a single message are way more effective than trying to stuff 3 messages into a single campaign. And go ahead and spread your bets. If you take X amount of dollars and you put it in one platform, you get a decent return. If you take that same X amount of dollars and spread it across different platforms, that omnichannel marketing that Colin was talking about, you tend to see an uplift. Finally, once you've chosen that message, don't think that it's that year's campaign. Don't worry about wear out. Wear out is largely a myth. It's largely a marketing thing. We all get sick of our own messaging and marketing long before the market even takes notice. This top chart here on the right, this is again from System 1. What this is measuring is the star rating of their ads and how old those ads are and how that star rating changes over time. I mentioned before that most ads rate about a 2.2 or 2.3, so that's what you're seeing there is the average. That leftmost blue column, those are ads that are only 6 weeks old. That rightmost blue column, those are ads that are up to 20 years old. Take a look. So what happens when you have big, huge, unprecedented times though? That's what the bottom chart's about. This bottom chart on the x-axis horizontally here, this is showing you what the star rating of those ads were back in January and February of 2020, or as I like to call them, the before times. The y-axis, the vertical chart here, that's showing you the star rating of those same ads. That's October, November 2020, so the first year of the pandemic. We're 6 months in, everyone's freaked out. That's a correlation of 0.9%. Correlations only go up to 1. That's a super strong correlation. That's about as close to a perfect chart as you can get without fudging the data. So don't worry about wear out. Pick a message, put it everywhere, stick with it. And if you really have to choose between tightly targeting and going broad, go for reach. Target broadly because it drives the most results and the most strong business effects. In fact, if you wind up asking yourself in a conversation, do we need to go ahead and focus on current customers and cross-sell, or should we go ahead and try and focus on new customer acquisition? The answer to that question is yes. It's a both and, it's not an either or. If you aim for new customers though, what's going to happen is your current customers are going to notice your marketing and advertising communications anyway. So go for reach. Don't worry about trying to win every single online auction and overpaying to target a certain segment. Go for reach, and you're going to go ahead and saturate everyone. And then finally, we have to make sure that we put enough budget actually behind this. You can have the best plan and the best strategy in the world, right? But you're not going to win it if you just go ahead and drop a rock in the ocean and expect everyone to feel the ripples on the shore. And one good rule to do to go ahead and try and figure out that budget is looking at share of voice versus share of market. There's a really strong correlation between companies' share of voice, the percentage of advertising spend they control in the category, and share of market. When people achieve excess share of voice and overspend relative to competitors, you tend to see market share rise to meet that percentage. It's a lagging indicator, it takes about a year or so. When you cut it, Sometimes you don't see bad effects right away, but usually within a year, your share of market tends to shrink to go ahead and align with your share of voice. And if you do these things, and if you can set that course and hold it for a while, the payoff here can be fairly substantial. This again is from the Institute of the Practitioners of Advertising, that same data set I was showing you before. You'll notice that these large business effects, defined as profitability, market share growth, reduction in price sensitivity, they grow over time. That ESOV, see that drop off in the third chart where that ESOV efficiency falls? That's because you can't just throw infinite money at something. It doesn't work that way. You're going to see diminishing returns eventually. But if you can go ahead and get ahead of competitors that first year, you're going to go ahead and claim a larger share, and that shows up as growth in large business effects, in large profit gains by years 2 and by years 3. Why does it take time? It's because brand is a memory. It takes time to build those networks. It takes time to build those associations and refresh them and be top of mind so that when a customer goes from being that 95% of the market that doesn't have a need to being part of the 5% of the market who does have a need, they're going to search their memory first for who's the best company that's positioned to fulfill that need. And you want to be top of mind. You're going to do that through share of voice. To illustrate what's possible with this, some people may know Jeremy Bullmore, famous ad man, just passed away a couple months ago. Bullmore talks about this story a couple years ago in an article he published on WARC, the Worldwide Advertising Research Council, where he goes to lunch with Len Heath, who's another ad guy who just sold his agency. He says, I need to drive you back to your office. You got to see my car, and it's an Aston Martin. And he says, he goes, you may be interested to know why I bought this Aston Martin. He goes, it's because I saw an advertisement. He says, but the interesting part is that I saw this advertisement when I was 14 years old. So to bring things back around to today, I do think that we may be at a Gutenberg moment with things like generative AI, but I think it's really important to balance the promise of what's new with what's proven in the past to work. And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is to look for antecedents. And just be a little bit cautious about where we place our bets and how much we want to invest in this part of the hype cycle, right? Like if you look at Kevin Kruz's article from the New York Times a couple months ago, an interaction that he had with Bing where Bing seemed to be performing as a human. One of the things that really reminded me of was ELIZA, the MIT chatbot therapist that was developed back in 1966. ELIZA was one of the first programs to really be able to chat back to people. It does like Rogerian therapy, where it basically repeats your question back to you, slightly modified in order to elicit a further answer. The guy at MIT who developed this, he gave the program to a couple of colleagues, and they responded by asking him, can you please leave the room? I need a chat with ELIZA. In many ways, ELIZA is the original ChatGPT. So if we go back from Web 3.0 to Web 2.0, if we look at social media and the revolution there and the idea that you could have people have social conversations, talk to newspapers, again, if you look back further in history, you also find antecedents. Colonial newspapers used to be printed in the U.S. with, what was before it was the U.S. at that time, of course, with really nice big margins. It's because the idea was that you would write marginalia in the margins, you would write your own comments, and you would pass around the colony. So I think that this illustrates another big truth for us, which is that media has really always been social. So some of these things that seem like they are groundbreaking, that they inaugurate a new kind of relationship, that they inaugurate a new kind of human being, just tend not to be so. And that's not to throw cold water on the idea. I actually find a lot of comfort in this idea. If we think about the revolution of Web 1.0, user-generated content, this idea that brands are no longer in a broadcast mode, that they have to be in a conversation with their consumers. This is also a really old idea. This is a cuneiform complaint tablet from Babylon from about 1750 BC. It's from a guy named Nani, who sent one of his employees from Babylon across the Mesopotamia to go ahead and buy some copper ingots. What it basically says is, hey, these copper ingots are really crummy. They are not high quality. You stiffed me on this. I don't want to pay full price for this. Give me my money back. So when we think about this, it's sort of like the original one-star review. And I think it's illustrative of, if there's something we might be able to learn from this, it is the story of Nani and his copper went after something shiny, turned out to be not everything you thought it was going to be.